still trying to sketch in a frame for the particular kind of Neolithic culture that marked Western Europe, and especially Britain, which is the purpose of this course, the direction of this course anyway. This lecture is going to present two more Southwest Asian Neolithic cultures, which show the remarkable range in technology and in other aspects of human lifestyle which were typical of Neolithic culture in its western homeland. Great deal less range in southern Britain by the time the Neolithic legacy reaches there. But to understand the peculiar characteristics of the British version of the West European version of the Western Neolithic tradition, I think it's important to look at the homeland and to look at the vast range of possibilities which were worked out there. One possible cause of that maximum diversity may be the existence of long-distance trade in such commodities as obsidian, textiles, ceramics, ceramic figurines for decoration, as well as pots for useful purposes, as well as, of course, in grains and animal products. The site of Jericho in Israel, or Palestine, depending on current political redefinitions, was inhabited for several millennia by a remarkably old-fashioned culture, which was very slow to accept changes in technology or general lifestyle, despite environmental degradation going on at a terrible pace around them, and at the increasing rate of such changes in many of the cultures surrounding and impinging upon Jericho's territory. The chief alteration in the lifestyle of Jericho, according to the material evidence which we have available, was in fortification. They developed impressive walls to protect their much attacked and frequently destroyed settlement. Catal in southwestern Turkey, and I apologize to any Turk for my pronunciation, was much more than a village, even more so than Jericho was, really more even than a town with its 5,000 plus inhabitants. We should probably give in and call it a city. Jane Jacobs, writing in 1970 on the nature of the city, has proposed some very interesting definitions for a village, a town, and a city. A village is a place where people simply attend to survival, producing food. A town is a place where people do that, but also at certain times of the year or moments in a broader time space, produce something that marks it off. But this doesn't go on all the time. It's a sort of temporary export activity. A city lives from its production than its exports, even more than from its imports. And it attracts to itself the food production, which it does not directly carry out, or at least not as exclusively carry out as much as villages do. Okay, we should probably give in and call Catal and also Jericho cities in their way. First settled at the beginning of the 8th millennium, about 7000 BCE, Catal lasted 4 millennium, finally being abandoned for no evident reason. Its matriarchal earth religion was fully developed, and the quality of its crafts, which I think we really should call arts in many cases, made them objects of long distance and obviously highly profitable trade. Jericho first. Jericho is some 700 miles southwest from Jarmo, across the rivers of Mesopotamia, across the Syrian desert. It overlooks the Jordan River as that river flows into the Dead Sea. Today, Jericho is an abandoned man-made mound composed of some 20 layers of settlement. The earliest village was settled about 8500 BCE. It grew into town and city status, if we like those definitions, and then shrank a bit and was finally destroyed by an Egyptian army about 1560 BCE. By then, the town or city had developed a local reputation for its fortifications, which were impressive indeed, especially in view of the extreme simplicity of the inhabitants' lifestyle. Archaeologists haven't found yet any traces of the Jericho, the walls of which are described so vividly in the 2nd chapter of the biblical book of Joshua. That town would have been destroyed by the invading Hebrews in the 13th century BCE, some 2 centuries after we know the Egyptians ended the last of the Jerichos that we can find archaeologically. Perhaps the name Jericho was by then locally applied to any settlement with impressive walls, or perhaps the survivors of the Egyptian destruction of 2 centuries earlier had migrated to a new site which has not yet been discovered. The physical types of the inhabitants of all 20 levels of the 7 millennia of Jericho's existence are remarkably unvaried. 3 racial types have been found, but the great majority of them were a short, slim, long-headed people. The typical adult males just over 5 feet tall, the typical adult females just under 5 feet tall, and probably quite like modern Palestinians in coloration. The earliest houses at Jericho were round, stone and plaster imitations of the circular tents or stick huts of a hunting-gathering society. 3,000 years later, about 5,500 BCE, the people of Jericho, very likely the descendants, some of them at any rate, of the original settlers, had taken to building rectangular stone houses with very thick walls covered with coats of fine white plaster, not unlike the shining houses for which the Greek islands are famous today. Later, the people of Jericho returned to the roundhouse style, building them side by side with rectangular houses. The people of Jericho had an artistically evocative cult of the dead, attested by skulls covered with delicately modeled clay masks, something like death masks perhaps, or perhaps in death the person took on a new visage, a new character, if only we could interpret what the meaning of these beautiful objects were. Grim a bit, but beautiful as well. Aside from their walls, their houses, and their death masks, the material culture of the people of Jericho was both exquisite and minimal. A stubborn survivor of the lifestyle that had brought Mesolithic humans to the threshold of agriculture in the favorable conditions that followed the neothermal climate change of the previous millennium. Jericho was situated in a beautiful zone of live oak and pistachio forests, with cedars covering the mountains, patches of fig trees here and there, and wild grain and berries growing in profusion on the hillsides and the flatlands. Game animals like gazelles, with fearsome wild cattle, boar, and foxes came regularly to the banks of the Jordan and to the local springs, where they could be easily trapped. The climate of the first millennium of Jericho's 7-millennium existence was less dry than now, and all that foliage as ground cover made the most of the seasonal rainfall. In such an environment, the people of Jericho had little incentive to develop more than primitive agriculture, or wear more than minimal clothing, and apparently no shoes or sandals. Pottery came late and sparsely. Baskets and wooden vessels must have seemed good enough to this simple people. Even as their environment became less favorable over the next 6,000 years, the people of Jericho held on to their old ways, which may have attracted or perhaps outraged all those enemies who kept destroying the town but could not obliterate it until armies with trumpets and chariot-riding commanders became the arbiters of quieter people's destiny. Well, if Jarmo represents the dynamic early agricultural village, and many-layered Jericho represents the persistent survival of even simpler patterns along with the development of amazing new things like walls and exquisite death masks, the next major phase of Western Neolithic culture is splendidly revealed by the excavations at Catal in what is today south-central Turkey. Between 7,000 and 6,000 BCE, 12 layers of settlement were built on that 32-acre site with a probable average population of 5,000. That density of settlement made it an extraordinarily large town for its time, a proto-city. And this mound is accompanied by a smaller mound at its side, which has not been excavated, nor its population estimated, nor its relationship to the larger mound guessed at. Few, if any, of these rebuildings seem to have been caused by warfare. They were caused by fire. The climate was dry. The wood used in the roofs was highly flammable. Sometimes the inhabitants seem to have built one house on top of another without destroying the previous one, even without benefit of a fire. So determined were they to stay with their ancestral homes, focusing on the physical fact of their cohesion. The site was attractive enough, though not extraordinarily so, nothing like Jericho. The mound grew atop a small hill in the middle of a fertile upland plain 3,000 feet above sea level, ringed by mountains of volcanic origin, including one active volcano. From those neighboring mountains, the people of Catal mined obsidian, the valuable black natural glass, actually lighter than black in that particular region, which was a profitable item of long-distance trade all over the Near East, all over this homeland of Southwest Asian Neolithic culture. Farming the typical Southwest Asian crops must have been easy. It's clear that, however, that the types of wheat and barley that they used at Çatalhöyük came from wild ancestors several hundred miles to the east in the Taurus Mountains, now separating Turkey from Syria. So this is an already established type of foodstuff which is brought in. There's no local domestication evident in that side of their food supply. But rather than accumulating many domestic animals, which would have been easy on the plain above which Çatalhöyük rises, the inhabitants, for some reason, relied for their main diet supplementing meat source on hunting. Hunting also provided the leopard skin pelts which were the main formal garment of the people of Çatalhöyük and an important motif in their religious art. The people of this densely settled town were mostly of two racial types, evidently living in harmonious coexistence leading to intermarriage. The majority, roughly 60%, were long-headed or dolichocephalic race, to use the technical term, a long-headed race suggesting the current Mediterranean type, not unlike the predominant population of Jericho. The minority, some 40%, were stockier build with rounded heads, which are called brachycephalic heads. We can speak of the long-headed dolichocephalic and the round-headed brachycephalic people to use some of these wonderful archaeological terms. This racial type is sometimes called Alpine because this type can be seen all the way from Armenia, through Anatolia, through the Alpine mountains, indeed to western places bordering the Atlantic like Brittany, and certain Irish populations also seem to be Alpine. By the second stage Neolithic that we call the Bronze Age, these different races had mingled in the European world, in the European scene, but we can still identify a Mediterranean group, an Alpine group, and often a mixed group as well in these two important, I think we have to say, proto-urban Near Eastern settlements. The skeleton of the people of Çatalhöyük show very little sign of variation or of new blood beyond those two stocks over the 1,000 years of settlement. The average adult male was about 5 foot 8 inches tall at the beginning and at the end of that 1,000 years, and the average adult female 5 foot 4. And this would be true both of the dolichocephalic Mediterranean Çatalhöyükers and of the brachycephalic Alpine inhabitants of that difficult to pronounce place. These Neolithic people lived longer lives than their Paleolithic forebears in the region had. The average life expectancy reached 30 years of age or a little more, and certain individuals as old as 70 have been found in the very revealing burials of this community, about which more in just a few minutes. These burials also provide evidence of class differentiation. There is a clear difference in class structure in this community. The houses in all levels of Çatalhöyük shared walls, just like the Pueblo villages of New Mexico. And like the Anasazi forebears of the modern Pueblo dwellers, the people of Çatalhöyük entered their houses from the roof by ladders. In a way, these houses suggest man-made caves, even more womb-like than natural caves, because the dead were buried under the beds on which the living members of each household slept. Imagine the dreams of which these people were capable. The bones of these ancestors were reverently wrapped in interestingly patterned textiles after the cadavers had been exposed to the elements for some time, a burial process called excarnation, which we will meet again in Neolithic Britain. Typically, there are many types of burial practice, but quite common are inhumation, in which a body is placed, bones and flesh, into the ground. Cremation, in which, of course, the body is burnt and the ashes perhaps collected. And in between them is excarnation, in which the body is exposed to the elements, so the flesh will rot away or be carried away by vultures or whatever, and then the bones are reverently collected and brought to one or another place, obviously held in esteem, indeed reverence, by the people. In Çatalhöyük, they were wrapped up in these interestingly patterned textiles, which are very like modern kilim designs of Anatolia. So here we have a very ancient, continuous art. It's easy to see why this community was so reluctant to leave their hearths, to build a house on top of a house rather than even move over. And very difficult to explain why they finally did so, apparently all together, apparently without the pressure of conquest or plague or any other kind of traceable disaster. The interiors of these square houses show us what crafts the people practiced and how they saw their world. Paintings of men hunting, of their volcanoes smoking, of leopards and bulls and other favorite animals in a variety of designs, along with geometric figures, and most suggestively of all, of their mother goddess and her attendants, have been well preserved. I'd like to read you the description of what is probably the most striking painting in Çatalhöyük, a landscape, a description given by James Mellart, the British archaeologist who excavated there some 40 years ago, and who remains the great interpreter of the site. It is a slightly rhapsodic description, but I think it certainly represents the impact that the site of this painting must have made upon Mellart and his team when they first uncovered it. He speaks of a single wall painting which more than any other illustrates the artistic genius of the people of Çatalhöyük. Millard is pro-Çatalhöyük, no question about it. Painted on the north and east wall of a shrine of level 7, soon after 6200 BC, according to radiocarbon dating, it represents that rarest genre of early painting, a landscape, and needless to say, it is unique. In the foreground, of course, Millard only excavated about 14% of the town. We do not know what artistic treasures lie beyond that. In the foreground is shown a town with rectangular houses of varying sizes, with internal structures reminiscent of the Çatalhöyük houses that have already been indicated. Each house has its own walls, and they are placed one next to the other without any open spaces. The rows of houses rise in terraces up to the top of the mound. Beyond the town, and much smaller as if far away, rises a double-peaked mountain covered with dots. From its base, parallel lines extend. More lines erupt from its higher peak, and more dots are grouped beyond its right slope and in horizontal rows above its peak, interspersed with horizontal and vertical lines. It's a very complicated design, perhaps not clarified by this heightened prose. A clearer picture of a volcano in eruption could hardly have been painted. The fire coming out of the top, lava streaming from vents at its base, clouds of smoke and glowing ash hanging over its peak and raining down on and beyond the slopes of the volcano, are all combined in this painting. It's not difficult to localize this picture. Hasan Dağ, which rises to 10,673 feet, is the only twin-peaked volcano in central Anatolia, and it lies at the eastern end of the Konya Plain within view of Çatalhöyük. The central Anatolian volcanoes became extinct only in the 2nd millennium BC. Moreover, these volcanoes, and Hasan Dağ especially, were the source of much raw material, and particularly obsidian, for Çatalhöyük, a source from which the site probably derived much of its wealth. It may be surmised, says Millard, that it was not only for its great cutting power, its transparency, reflective power, and its jet-black appearance that this material was so highly prized. Its volcanic and thus chthonic origin would have linked it to the underworld, the place of the dead, and thus it was a true gift of Mother Earth, and therefore imbued with magical potency. These considerations, Millard concludes, may help in explaining why an artist late in the 7th millennium BC recorded the wonder and awe of a volcanic eruption against the foreground of the town of Çatalhöyük on the wall of one of its shrines. If the picture is unique, so was the occasion, and probably only at Çatalhöyük had Neolithic people reached the necessary degree of civilization or possessed the artistic genius to record such an event for posterity. Well, with such art, we can make some fairly secure guesses about the religion of this Neolithic city. 40 shrines have been uncovered at Çatalhöyük so far. James Millard, the British archaeologist who dug there in the 60s, worried that he might have uncovered the shrine section of the city. If that turns out to be the case, even so, that density would be striking anyway, and its concentration would suggest that the priestly class lived together rather than in dispersal throughout the rest of the population. If the rest of these layers of proto-urban settlement show anything like the same density of shrines, we will be able to conclude that this proto-city was intensely religious, more so than other Neolithic sites suggest their inhabitants were, at least in the Near East. In Western Europe, the religiosity of the people of southern Britain is quite remarkable. But it's a very different kind of religion. From the layout and furniture of these shrines, and the bones of the priestesses buried in them, it seems pretty obvious that the religion of the people was centered on women and directed by them. And if the religion was, the rest of what we call politics likely was too. Çatalhöyük may well have been the site of a matriarchy, of a matriarchal state, or proto-state. And why not, with a population density of that size, relatively greater than anything for hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles around, why not call it a state as well, and not simply a proto-state? The most recurrent image in the art of Çatalhöyük is a large, heavy, older woman who has been identified by Millard and others as the goddess, the mother goddess. It's hard to miss the appropriateness of that interpretation. Sometimes this mother goddess is shown seated on a throne in the act of delivering a child. In this pose, she often leans for support on two great cats, presumably the leopards, who were then still widespread in the region. We should remember that at that time the lion, the Asian lion, was an infrequent but certainly impressive visitor in the area that is now Turkey and Greece and Bulgaria as well. It would take some time before that dangerous creature would be eliminated. Sometimes this lady is accompanied by another younger woman and a child, but the younger woman is not always slimmer. These ladies were either remarkably well-fed, if these are realistic presentations. Maybe the women of Çatalhöyük were as well-fed, their bones will not tell us. Or perhaps the kind of immense adiposity, which is the clear mark of these women, is a sign of their divinity. Clearly lean, it was not better. It was certainly possible to be too thin in that culture. We see mother, daughter, and child, perhaps. Certainly we see mother, daughter, and child. Do we see goddess, lesser goddess, and the child who is indistinguishably boy or girl? We can't tell yet which this child will become. The goddess is sometimes depicted with a male figure, who may be her consort or her son, and who usually has a beard and sits on a bull. And the bull is clearly the sign of male sacrality, whereas figures of perfectly recognizable human females are all over the place and have been identified with religious cult. Very few images of men are available. When they do appear, they are usually riding on a bull or doing something otherwise fairly improbable. And it's generally assumed that the male principle is represented in this community by a symbol, by a lion of the male type, by a bull, by bull horns, by something perfectly clearly Freudianly phallic. Interesting that there is this hesitation to represent the male, when there's no hesitation at all in representing the female. So that those who speculate that we may have the beginning of a matriarchal religion and possibly a matriarchal political structure have a lot to go on. The art is very suggestive in this direction. If only the art that the Neolithic Britons left at Avebury and at Stonehenge and around were anything like as suggestive, we would be less mystified by the significance of these remarkable structures than we are. The dominant colors, red and black, may well represent life and death, Mellard says. On the other hand, they may simply represent something like skin and hair color. Men are much more constantly red, consistently and more darkly red in this art than women are. And this may perfectly well be a representation of the fact that men were very active in hunting and in a certain amount of farming and wore relatively little clothes in that warm climate. Men tended to be darkly sunburned. It's very typical of Egyptian art, early Egyptian art, that the male figure will always be well tanned and the female figure always very white, a sign of her leisure and of his activity. And their hair may well have been black. Mellard spends a certain amount of time going back and forth between these two possible interpretations of the meaning of this art. Is it realistic? Is it representational? Is it naturalistic? Or is it entirely symbolic? One of the other interesting things about the religion of Çatalhöyük is that the people there avoided bloody sacrifices. In fact, there's almost no sign of any kind of bloody sacrifice. Instead, small packets of grain or of tools, the fruits of these skillful people's labors, were offered on the shrine's altars. Also noteworthy is the curious absence of pig, wild or domesticated, in the diet of Çatalhöyük. There are many jaws of wild boars which are inserted into the walls of these houses which Mellard has called shrines. But the other bones of pig, which you tend to find in kind of middens and garbage heaps where the bones of eaten animals are flung after the consumption of their meat, pig bones are very rare there indeed. And it may be that wild boars of the region were hunted, killed, their heads removed, and their jaws brought into the shrines. Interestingly enough, in most cases, the jaws of the wild boars are covered by clay depictions of the female breast, as ample as is the rest of the anatomy of the women of this culture. Very striking connection, hard to know what to make of it. But the absence of pig, which was perfectly available as a meat, in the diet, or not the total absence, but the relative absence, is very striking. One has to wonder if this could be the earliest indication of the pork taboo that would become so important a feature of Jewish and Muslim religion. One has to wonder where the inhabitants of Catal went when they all left, apparently all at once. They must have gone somewhere. If they headed south, could we find there perhaps remote forebears of the Hebrew cult, which distinguished itself from its neighbors by this very distinctive pork taboo, which was then picked up by the religion of Islam, which liked to think of itself as the truest daughter of the Hebrew revelation. The crafts of Catal are really outstanding. Jewelry was manufactured for trade as well as local use, and the jewelry, of course, makes the most of obsidian. Obsidian is this fascinating material, this volcanic glass, which is remarkably sharp. You can perform surgical instruments of modern refinement, surgical operations of modern refinement with obsidian instruments. And it would appear that obsidian instruments a little bit later and elsewhere would be used in such delicate activities as trepanning, that is, performing a surgical operation on the skull, either to remove pressure, possibly to remove tumors. This sort of thing was done even by Paleolithic forebears when they began to use obsidian as well. So it's a remarkable material. But the very fact of its sharpness means that it's very brittle. So to shape it at anything other than a blade is extremely difficult. And yet the people of Catal would do that. They would take obsidian, this hard and brittle stone, and other stones closer in structure to granite, though not granite actually, and they would make beads with holes going through the beads so very, very fine that modern pins are very difficult to insert within them, which also tells you that the kind of thread which was used or the kind of wire which was used was itself of a remarkable refinement. Well, probably thread rather than wire, because no trace of wires has been found, and much of the thread would, of course, have eroded away by now. Some of those great kilim rugs have not eroded, but this kind of random textile would be very likely not to last for very long. Pottery came late in the 6th layer. In other words, about halfway through almost. So rather like Jarmo, Catal was at first aceramic. But once they picked up pottery in imitation of their neighbors, they executed their pots beautifully. And not only was their pottery used locally, but it was traded. And one can track the trade routes and the patterns and see how many miles away the China, so to speak, the pottery of Catal was appreciated by other Neolithic cultures in the area. Perhaps in fact, there's a considerable difference in the style of pottery produced in different sections of the city. Mellor thoroughly excavated only about 14% of the city and feared that he had hit the priestess quarter, the shrine quarter. But there were sort of sample digs in other portions of the mound, and there it was clear that the western part of the city produced a style of pottery that was much more vivid in its kind of linear decoration than was the pottery produced elsewhere in town, at least according to these initial digs, these initial probes. So it's a very complicated story, just like everything else at Catal. Perhaps most striking of all are the textiles, skillfully dyed and woven in complex designs, very like those of Turkish kilims today. But that is putting it a little bit too simply. There are lots of kilim-type designs. There are also remarkably curvilinear designs suggesting a style of textile decoration that would appear only millennia later in Iran and become part of a typical Persian curvilinear style. There are lots of different styles which are woven into these woolen textiles. The people liked carpets, which is hard to imagine they didn't export as well. And so we might have expected that the production of carpets to be a craft of pastoral nomads rather than of a settled agricultural community. In fact, many of the Oriental rugs made today are indeed just such a product, the product of a nomadic people. Although it's easier to loom a carpet, of course, when you're staying in one place. But many nomadic people moves from one pasture area where it stays for several weeks or even months to another pasture area, again a semi-permanent, semi-sedentary settlement, and there more weaving is done than while they're on the road. But we see not that pattern at all. We see a city not only agricultural, but highly urbanized, which is the earliest site of this oldest of human crafts. The Oriental rug, after all, is still one of the world's favorite commodities for long-distance commerce. So many questions about Catal. One of the most interesting ones for this overview that I'm trying to give of Neolithic cultures is the question of its size and its sophistication. Could the quality and the aggressive promotion of the crafts and trade goods of Çatalhöyük help explain why it became by far the largest human settlement in its context a big city in the Neolithic world of Southwest Asia? Nothing of that magnitude, at any rate in urbanity, would ever be produced in Neolithic Europe.